The chandeliers of Devonshire House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns and jewelled tiaras as London's elite gathered for the season's most anticipated engagement ball. But amidst the splendour and celebration, one young woman stood frozen at the top of the marble staircase, her face ashen beneath the rouge her maid had so carefully applied. Miss Eleanor Ashford. Eversley's fingers trembled against the balustrade as her eyes, those expressive hazel eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and hope, met those of her guardian across the crowded ballroom. In that single glance, Alexander Caldwell, Duke of Ashborn, saw something that chilled him to his very core, pure, unmitigated terror. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about his ward's upcoming marriage shattered like fragile crystal. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're hearing this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The spring of 1815 had arrived with unusual warmth, painting the English countryside in vibrant shades of emerald and gold. At Ashbourne Manor, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Ashborn in Kent, preparations for a grand celebration had transformed the estate into a hive of activity. Servants hurried through marble corridors bearing armfuls of white roses and silver ribbons, while in the kitchens, the preparation of elaborate dishes filled the air with the scent of roasted meats and spiced pastries. At the centre of all this orchestrated chaos was Miss Eleanor Ashford Eversley, ward to His Grace the Duke of Ashborn since the tragic death of her parents in a carriage accident 7 years prior. At 20 years of age, Eleanor possessed the kind of beauty that artists struggled to capture on canvas. Delicate features framed by waves of chestnut hair, intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to hold entire libraries of unspoken thoughts, and a graceful bearing that spoke of excellent breeding despite her orphan status. But on this particular morning, as she sat in the morning room overlooking the manicured gardens, Eleanor's usually animated features were composed into a mask of dutiful acceptance. Before her lay the latest letter from her betrothed, Lord Percival Stirling, heir to the Earl of Blackwood and one of the most eligible gentlemen in England. The letter, written in his bold, commanding hand, detailed his expectations for their upcoming nuptials with the same precision he might use to draft a business contract. "My dear Miss Eversley," it began, without warmth or genuine affection, "I trust preparations for our union proceed according to schedule. I have taken the liberty of instructing the modiste that your wedding trousseau should reflect the dignity and restraint befitting the future Countess of Blackwood. Excessive display is vulgar, and I expect my wife to embody refined simplicity in all things. Furthermore, I have prepared a list of the social obligations you will be expected to fulfill, as well as the manner in which you shall conduct yourself in society. My mother, the Countess, will of course provide additional guidance in the management of our household, as she has graciously agreed to remain in residence at Blackwood Hall indefinitely." The letter continued for 3 more pages, each paragraph a carefully constructed cage of expectations, restrictions, and demands. Not once did Lord Stirling inquire about Eleanor's own wishes, her thoughts, or her feelings. She was, in his estimation, a suitable acquisition, well-bred, intelligent enough to be an interesting companion, but not so opinionated as to challenge his authority, and possessed of a modest fortune that would complement his own substantial holdings. Eleanor set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly, her gaze drifting to the gardens where she had spent countless happy hours during her youth. She remembered arriving at Ashbourne Manor as a grief-stricken girl of 13, lost in the overwhelming sorrow of her parents' sudden death. The Duke, then only 26 himself and newly elevated to the title after his own father's passing, had been unexpectedly kind. He had given her time to grieve, encouraged her voracious appetite for learning, and never made her feel like an unwanted burden despite the responsibility thrust upon him. Their relationship had been one of comfortable friendship for years. Alexander, though she would never dare address him so informally to his face, had treated her as a younger sister, taking genuine interest in her education and ensuring she had access to his extensive library. He had laughed at her witty observations, engaged in spirited debates about literature and philosophy, and created a home where she felt valued not for her connections or dowry, but for herself. But all of that had changed 6 months ago, when the Duke had approached her in his study with news that would alter the course of her life. Lord Percival Stirling had formally requested her hand in marriage, and Alexander, after careful consideration, had accepted the offer on her behalf. "It is an excellent match, Eleanor," he had said, his blue eyes, usually so warm when they rested upon her, carefully neutral. "Lord Stirling is a man of impeccable character and substantial fortune. You will want for nothing as his wife. The alliance will secure your future in a way I could never accomplish through my guardianship alone." Eleanor had stood before his desk, feeling as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she had no wish to marry Lord Stirling, that she had met the gentleman on only 3 occasions and found him cold and condescending. She wanted to confess the secret she had guarded so carefully for the past 2 years, that somewhere along the way, her sisterly affection for her guardian had transformed into something far more dangerous and impossible, that she had fallen hopelessly, irrevocably in love with the Duke of Ashborn himself. But of course, she had said none of those things. What could she say? That she, a penniless orphan living on his charity, dared to harbour romantic feelings for one of England's most eligible peers. It was laughable, pathetic even. The Duke would marry eventually, probably to some diamond of the first water, with impeccable lineage and a substantial dowry. He would choose a woman who could stand beside him as an equal, not a ward he had inherited through his father's friendship with her late parents. So instead, Eleanor had curtsied deeply and murmured her acceptance with downcast eyes, playing the role of the grateful ward who recognized the honor being bestowed upon her. In the weeks that followed, she had tried desperately to convince herself that this marriage was indeed a blessing. Lord Stirling was handsome in a severe, classical way, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing grey eyes. He was intelligent, well-educated, and moved in the highest circles of society. His estates in Northumberland were reportedly magnificent, and his fortune was rumoured to be one of the largest in England. But with each meeting, each carefully chaperoned conversation, Eleanor's unease had grown. There was something in the way Lord Stirling looked at her, as though she were a prized mare he was evaluating for purchase, rather than a woman he hoped to spend his life with. His compliments, when he bothered to offer them, were perfunctory and focused entirely on her appearance and accomplishments that reflected well on him. He never asked about her thoughts on literature, despite knowing she loved to read. He showed no interest in her opinions on any matter of substance. More troubling still were the small moments that revealed his true character. The way he spoke dismissively to servants, the cold calculation in his eyes when discussing business matters, the subtle cruelty in his comments about those he deemed beneath him socially. During their 3rd meeting, Eleanor had witnessed him publicly humiliate a young clerk who had made an error in some paperwork, his voice dripping with contempt as he destroyed the poor man's dignity before a room full of witnesses. And then there was the incident that had truly frightened her, though she had told no one about it. 3 weeks ago, during a garden party at Blackwood Hall, Lord Stirling had manoeuvred her away from the other guests under the pretence of showing her the estate's famous rose garden. Once they were alone, he had suddenly grasped her wrist, not gently, but with bruising force, and pulled her close. "You are to be my wife, Eleanor," he had said, his breath hot against her ear, his voice low and threatening. "It would be wise to remember that fact. I am not a man who tolerates disobedience or independent thought in women. Your guardian may have indulged your blue-stocking tendencies, but I assure you, such behavior will not be permitted once you bear my name. You will comport yourself exactly as I instruct, or you will learn the consequences of defiance. Eleanor had stood frozen, her heart pounding with fear, unable to form words as Lord Stirling's fingers dug painfully into her flesh. He had released her only when they heard other guests approaching, his expression transforming instantly into one of pleasant courtesy, as though the previous moment had never occurred. That night, Eleanor had lain awake in her bed at Ashbourne Manor, her wrist still bearing the faint marks of his grip, and seriously considered fleeing. But where could she go? She had no family, no independent means, no protector save the Duke himself, and Alexander had arranged this marriage in good faith, believing it to be in her best interest. If she were to confess her fears to him, what could she say? That his carefully chosen suitor had frightened her with words and a rough grasp, that she sensed a darkness in Lord Stirling that others seemed blind to. The Duke would think her hysterical, or worse, ungrateful for the advantageous match he had secured. So Eleanor had done what young women of her station were taught to do. She had accepted her fate with outward grace and hidden her growing terror beneath practiced smiles. Now, as she sat with Lord Stirling's latest letter before her, Eleanor felt the walls of her golden cage closing in. The engagement ball was scheduled for tonight at Devonshire House, one of London's most prestigious residences. Tomorrow, the formal announcement would appear in the Times. In 6 weeks, she would become Lady Stirling, and her life as she knew it would end. A soft knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Enter," she called, quickly folding the letter and composing her features. The door opened to reveal Martha, her lady's maid, a kind woman of middle years who had served Eleanor since her arrival at Ashbourne Manor. "Begging your pardon, Miss Eleanor, but the modiste has arrived with your gown for this evening. Shall I have her bring it up to your chambers?" "Yes, thank you, Martha." Eleanor rose from her seat, smoothing her morning dress with hands that still trembled slightly. "I shall be up directly." As Martha departed, Eleanor took one last look at the gardens of Ashbourne Manor, the only true home she had known since her parents' death. Soon she would leave this place forever, traded from one man's protection to another's possession. The thought made her chest constrict with a grief so profound she could scarcely draw breath. "Miss Eleanor?" Martha had returned, concern evident in her voice. "Are you quite well? You've gone dreadfully pale." Eleanor forced a brittle smile. "I am perfectly well, Martha, simply overwhelmed by the festivities ahead. Come, let us see this gown that is to make me the envy of every lady in London." But as she climbed the stairs to her chambers, Eleanor could not shake the sensation that she was walking toward her own execution, that tonight's ball would mark not a joyous celebration, but the beginning of a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. If only she could have known how prophetic that feeling would prove to be, though not in any way she could have imagined. The interior of Devonshire House that evening resembled something from a fairy tale, or perhaps a gilded trap. Countless candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light reflected and multiplied by strategically placed mirrors until the entire ballroom seemed to glow with ethereal brilliance. The cream of London society had gathered for the occasion, their jewels glittering and silk gowns rustling as they moved through the elegant space in choreographed patterns of social ritual. Eleanor stood at the entrance to the ballroom, her hand resting lightly on the Duke of Ashborn's arm as they prepared to make their entrance. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace, designed to showcase her youth and beauty while maintaining the modesty Lord Stirling demanded. Her chestnut hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure, with small white roses tucked among the curls. Around her neck hung a simple strand of pearls, a gift from the Duke for this momentous occasion. "You look beautiful, Eleanor," Alexander said quietly, his voice warm with what might have been paternal pride. "Lord Stirling is a fortunate man indeed." Eleanor managed a tremulous smile, not trusting herself to speak. All evening she had been fighting a rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The Duke, she knew, had no idea of the true nature of her feelings, neither her impossible love for him nor her terror of the man she was meant to marry. To him, she was simply his ward, nervous as any bride might be on such an important occasion. "Come," Alexander said gently, patting her hand where it rested on his arm. "Lord Stirling awaits you at the foot of the stairs. Let us not keep him waiting." They descended the grand marble staircase together, and Eleanor's gaze found Lord Percival Stirling immediately. He stood in the centre of a small group of admirers, resplendent in formal evening attire that emphasized his considerable height and aristocratic bearing. His dark hair was perfectly arranged, his cravat tied in an intricate pattern that spoke of hours before a mirror. He looked every inch the perfect gentleman, the ideal husband. But Eleanor saw what others did not, the cold calculation in his grey eyes as he watched her descend, the possessive set of his jaw, the way his gaze travelled over her body with the clinical assessment of a man evaluating property. When their eyes met, she saw no warmth, no affection, not even basic kindness. What she saw instead made her blood run cold, absolute certainty of ownership, tinged with something darker that she dared not name. And in that moment, Eleanor faltered. Her step hitched, her grip on the Duke's arm tightened convulsively, and her face, carefully painted with rouge and powder, went deathly pale beneath the cosmetics. Alexander felt the change in her immediately. He glanced down at his ward, and what he saw in her face struck him like a physical blow. This was not the nervous excitement of a bride. This was fear, raw, genuine, bone-deep terror. Eleanor's eyes were wide and glazed, her breathing rapid and shallow, her entire body rigid with barely suppressed panic. "Eleanor!" he said sharply, stopping their descent. "What is wrong?" But before she could answer, before she could find words to explain the inexplicable dread that had seized her, Lord Stirling was there, climbing the stairs to meet them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My dear Miss Eversley," he said smoothly, his voice carrying to the assembled guests below. "You are a vision this evening. Come, let me escort you. The musicians await our signal to begin the dancing." He extended his hand toward her, and Eleanor saw in its reach not an offer, but a command. Her throat closed completely, her vision beginning to narrow at the edges. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand frozen like a rabbit before a snake. It was the Duke's military training that saved her from complete collapse. Feeling her sway dangerously, Alexander wrapped a supporting arm around her waist, even as he addressed Lord Stirling with perfect courtesy. "I beg your pardon, Stirling, but I believe my ward requires a moment to compose herself. The excitement of the evening has perhaps been overwhelming. If you would be so kind as to wait in the ballroom, I shall bring her to you momentarily." Lord Stirling's expression flickered, just for an instant, with something ugly, before his practiced smile returned. "Of course, Your Grace. I understand completely. Miss Eversley has always been rather delicate. I shall await you both in the ballroom." He descended with perfect grace, his bearing that of an understanding and patient bridegroom. But Eleanor, watching him go, saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the tight clench of his jaw, and knew she would pay dearly later for this public display of weakness. "Eleanor, look at me." The Duke's voice was low and urgent, compelling her attention. When she finally raised her eyes to his, he was shocked by what he saw there. Not just fear, but desperate, silent pleading. "Tell me truthfully, do you wish to proceed with this marriage?" It was the question she had longed to hear for months, and yet now that he had asked it, Eleanor found herself paralyzed by conflicting impulses. To say no would mean confessing her fears, explaining her reasons, potentially destroying the alliance the Duke had so carefully arranged. It would mean admitting her own foolishness in not speaking sooner. And what alternatives did she have? To remain at Ashbourne Manor indefinitely, watching Alexander eventually marry another woman, living on his charity like some pathetic spinster aunt. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am simply nervous, Your Grace. It is natural, is it not? Every bride must feel thus on such an occasion." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes told a different story entirely. Alexander, who had commanded men in battle and learned to read truth beneath deception, saw it clearly. Something was very wrong, and he cursed himself for having been blind to it until this moment. "We need not proceed if you are unwilling," he said firmly. "I am your guardian, Eleanor. Your welfare is my primary concern. If Lord Stirling has done or said anything to frighten you, please—" Eleanor's voice broke on the word. "Please, do not make a scene. Everyone is watching. I shall compose myself and continue. I must." Alexander wanted to argue, wanted to sweep her up and carry her away from this place, from Lord Stirling, from whatever had put that haunted look in her eyes. But they were indeed surrounded by society's most influential members, all watching avidly for any hint of scandal. To create a scene now would ruin Eleanor's reputation irreparably. "Very well," he said reluctantly, though everything in him rebelled against the decision. "But we shall speak privately after the first dance. If you give me any indication that you truly wish to escape this engagement, I shall end it immediately. Consequences be damned." Eleanor nodded shakily, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Together they completed their descent into the ballroom, where Lord Stirling waited with a smile that didn't extend beyond his lips. "Feeling better, my dear?" he asked as Eleanor was transferred from the Duke's protective arm to his own possessive grip. His fingers closed around her gloved hand with just slightly more pressure than necessary, a subtle reminder of that day in the rose garden. "You gave us quite a fright." "I am well now, my lord," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I apologize for the disruption." Think nothing of it," Lord Stirling replied, leading her toward the center of the ballroom, where the first dance would take place. But as they moved away from the Duke, he leaned close and whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "However, such displays of weakness reflect poorly on me, Eleanor. We shall discuss your conduct in private later. I trust you understand." The implied threat was unmistakable. Eleanor's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to maintain a serene expression as they took their positions for the opening waltz. Around them, other couples arranged themselves, and the orchestra began the opening strains of music. As they danced, Eleanor was acutely aware of Lord Stirling's hand at her waist, not caressing but controlling, guiding her movements with iron precision. He danced beautifully, his steps perfect and assured, and to all observers they must have appeared the ideal couple. But Eleanor felt as though she were dancing with a predator, and every turn brought her closer to an inescapable fate. From the edge of the ballroom, the Duke of Ashborn watched them with growing unease. He knew Eleanor as well as he knew his own family, perhaps better. He had watched her grow from a grief-stricken child into an extraordinary young woman, possessed of keen intelligence, gentle humor, and quiet strength. He knew her habits, her preferences, her moods, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that what he had seen on the staircase was not mere bridal nervousness. "She is terrified of him," said a quiet voice at his elbow. Alexander turned to find his great-aunt, the Dowager Duchess, Margaret Caldwell, regarding the dancing couple with shrewd eyes. At 72, the Dowager Duchess remained formidable, a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper tongue who had survived 3 monarchs and countless scandals with her reputation intact. "Aunt Margaret," Alexander acknowledged, grateful for her presence. "You see it too, then?" "I would be blind not to, nephew." The girl looked as though she were being led to the gallows rather than her engagement ball. The Dowager Duchess tapped her fan against her palm thoughtfully. "Have you inquired into Lord Stirling's character beyond his fortune and connections?" "Of course," Alexander replied, feeling defensive. "His reputation is impeccable. He has never been involved in any scandal. His estates are profitable and well managed. His family, the Dowager Duchess interrupted dryly, consists of a domineering mother who has driven away 3 companions in as many years, and a father who spends more time at his club than at home, likely to escape said wife. Lord Stirling himself has a reputation for being cold and exacting in his business dealings. Some might call it admirable efficiency. Others might note that men who are cruel in business rarely show warmth in their personal lives. Alexander felt his chest tighten with growing anger, directed not at his aunt, but at himself. How had he missed these signs? He had been so focused on securing Eleanor's future, on fulfilling his duty as her guardian, that he had failed to look deeper into the character of the man he was entrusting with her happiness. "There is something else," the Dowager Duchess continued, her voice dropping lower. "Lady Whitmore's daughter, Arabella. You know the girl, blonde and rather sharp-featured. She and Lord Stirling were quite close last season. There was talk of an understanding between them, though nothing formal. After Eleanor's engagement was announced, Arabella appeared at several social functions, with bruises on her arms, poorly concealed by gloves and long sleeves. When questioned, she claimed to have taken a fall from her horse. "You think Stirling was responsible?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think," the Dowager Duchess said carefully, "that when a man is thwarted in his romantic intentions and the woman in question subsequently appears with unexplained injuries, it warrants investigation. And I think that our dear Eleanor may have seen or experienced something that has shown her Lord Stirling's true nature." On the dance floor, the waltz was concluding. Lord Stirling led Eleanor through the final turns with flawless precision, then bowed formally over her hand as the music ended. Applause rippled through the ballroom, and the assembled guests began pressing forward to offer their congratulations to the newly affirmed couple. It was then that Lady Arabella Whitmore made her entrance. She swept into the ballroom like a storm given human form, her golden hair elaborately dressed, her gown of deep blue silk cut just slightly lower than was strictly proper. Her pretty face was flushed, and there was a wild, reckless gleam in her blue eyes that suggested she had been drinking before her arrival. "Lord Stirling," she called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "How wonderful to see you celebrating your engagement. I simply had to come and offer my congratulations, despite not receiving an invitation." Every eye in the room turned to watch as Lady Arabella made her way through the crowd, which parted before her like water. Lord Stirling's face had gone rigid, his grey eyes cold as winter frost. "Lady Arabella," he said icily, "what an unexpected pleasure." "Oh, I'm certain it is," Arabella replied, her smile sharp as a blade. She turned her attention to Eleanor, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. "And this must be the fortunate bride-to-be. Tell me, Miss Eversley, has my dear Percival shown you his true nature yet? Or is he still playing the role of the perfect gentleman?" "Arabella, you are drunk," Lord Stirling snapped, grasping her arm. Too hard, Eleanor noticed, his fingers digging into flesh. "Leave at once before you embarrass yourself further." But Lady Arabella was not to be silenced. She wrenched her arm free, though Eleanor saw her wince at the pain, and addressed the assembled crowd with the fearlessness of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it is my duty to warn Miss Eversley of what awaits her in marriage to Lord Stirling. You see, I was once in her position, well, nearly so. Percival and I had an understanding, or so I believed, until I made the mistake of disagreeing with him on some trivial matter." She pushed up her sleeve, revealing a bracelet of fading bruises around her wrist. "This was his response, and when I threatened to make his brutality known, he calmly informed me that no one would believe me over him, that my reputation would be destroyed while his remained pristine." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Lord Stirling's face had gone from rigid to murderous, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You lying whore," he snarled, all pretense of gentlemanly behavior abandoned. "I never laid a hand on you. You're nothing but a jealous, desperate woman fabricating stories because I chose another over you." "Am I?" Arabella turned to Eleanor, her eyes now genuinely sad beneath the bravado. "Look at yourself, Miss Eversley. Look at your wrist. the one he held in the rose garden 3 weeks ago. Eleanor's hand flew instinctively to her left wrist, which Lord Stirling had indeed gripped with bruising force. The marks had faded, but not entirely, and in that moment, with all eyes upon her, she knew she had a choice to make. She could remain silent, allow Lord Stirling to dismiss Lady Arabella as a scorned woman seeking revenge, and proceed with a marriage that terrified her. Or she could find the courage to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor raised her chin and met the Duke's eyes across the ballroom. In them, she saw not judgment but concern, not disappointment, but fierce protectiveness. And in that gaze, she found the strength she had been seeking. "Lord Stirling did indeed grip my wrist in the rose garden," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He told me that he would not tolerate disobedience or independent thought, that I would comport myself exactly as he instructed, or I would learn the consequences of defiance." Those were his exact words. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the Duke of Ashborn's footsteps as he crossed the ballroom with deliberate, deadly purpose. "The engagement," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is ended. Miss Eversley will not be marrying Lord Stirling. Not now, not ever." Lord Stirling's face contorted with rage. "You cannot simply break a formal engagement. The contracts have been drawn up, the settlement agreed upon." "I can and I have," Alexander interrupted coldly. "As Eleanor's guardian, I have absolute authority over such matters until she reaches her majority. And I would rather see her die a spinster than marry a man who threatens and brutalizes women." "This is outrageous," Lord Stirling thundered. "You would take the word of a desperate spinster and a hysterical girl over that of a peer of the realm. I demand satisfaction for this insult." "Gladly," Alexander replied, his tone deadly calm. "Name your seconds. I shall be pleased to meet you at dawn." But before the challenge could be formalized, the Dowager Duchess stepped forward, her aged voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I think not, Lord Stirling. You see, while you've been making a spectacle of yourself this evening, my own sources have been gathering rather interesting information about your activities. Did you truly believe that your gambling debts in the hells of St. James would remain secret forever? Or that your investments in that scandalous establishment off Covent Garden wouldn't eventually come to light?" Lord Stirling's face went from red to ashen in an instant. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" The Dowager Duchess smiled coldly. "I have in my possession signed statements from 3 of the women employed at said establishment, detailing your particular proclivities. I also have documentation of debts totaling nearly £50,000, which you intended to pay using Miss Eversley's dowry. Shall I continue, or would you prefer to withdraw gracefully and leave London immediately?" The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Lord Stirling looked around the ballroom, seeing in every face not sympathy but disgust, not support but condemnation. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely, revealing the hollow, cruel man beneath. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and venomous. He turned to Eleanor, and the naked hatred in his eyes made her step back instinctively. "You will regret this humiliation, Miss Eversley. Both of you will." And with that, Lord Percival Stirling turned on his heel and strode from the ballroom, Lady Arabella's quiet sobbing and the scandalized whispers of society's elite following him into the night. Eleanor stood frozen, unable to fully process what had just transpired. In the span of minutes, her entire life had been irrevocably altered. The engagement was broken, her reputation was in tatters, and she had publicly defied one of England's most powerful families. She should have felt devastated. Instead, as the Duke of Ashborn reached her side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The scandal of the broken engagement dominated London society for exactly 3 days before the Dowager Duchess Margaret Caldwell made her move. True to her word, Detailed accounts of Lord Stirling's gambling debts, his investments in disreputable establishments, and testimony from multiple women regarding his violent tendencies appeared, with convenient anonymity, in several influential gossip columns. Within a week, Lord Stirling had fled to the continent to escape his creditors, and Eleanor's courageous stand was being reframed by the ton's more progressive members as an act of admirable self-preservation rather than scandalous rebellion. Nevertheless, the Duke of Ashborn deemed it wise to remove Eleanor from London's intense scrutiny. 2 weeks after the disastrous ball, Eleanor found herself installed in the Dowager Duchess's elegant townhouse in Bath, that genteel haven of culture and society where the quality went to take the waters and engage in slightly less cutthroat social warfare than the London season provided. Eleanor stood at the window of her new chambers, gazing out at the honey-coloured Georgian architecture that lined the streets below. Spring had fully arrived, painting the city in shades of green and gold, and the parks were filled with ladies taking their constitutional walks and gentlemen tipping their hats in greeting. It was beautiful, civilized, and utterly removed from the catastrophe she had left behind. Still brooding, child? The Dowager Duchess swept into the room without bothering to knock, as was her habit. At 72, she moved with the energy and purpose of a woman half her age. That won't do at all. We have callers this afternoon, and I'll not have you greeting them with that tragic expression. You look like a Gothic heroine awaiting her doom. Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. In the weeks since the broken engagement, the Dowager Duchess had become not just a protector, but something approaching a friend. Her sharp wit and refusal to tolerate self-pity had been precisely what Eleanor needed to begin recovering from the trauma of her near marriage to Lord Stirling. "I was merely reflecting on how quickly one's life can change," Eleanor said quietly. "A month ago, I was preparing to become Lady Stirling. Now I am—" She trailed off, uncertain how to complete the sentence. "Free," the Dowager Duchess supplied firmly. "You are free, Eleanor. And while I'll admit that your situation is not ideal, your reputation has been somewhat tarnished, and your prospects for an advantageous marriage have diminished, you are alive, unharmed, and no longer shackled to a monster. That, my dear girl, is no small victory." Eleanor turned from the window, studying the formidable woman who had saved her. "Why did you help me? You barely knew me before that night." The Dowager Duchess settled herself in a chair with a sigh, her aristocratic features softening slightly. "Because I was you once." "Oh, not precisely. My situation was different. But I too was nearly married to a man of sterling reputation and secret cruelty. Unlike you, I did not have the courage to refuse him. I spent 15 years as the Duchess of Ashborn to a man who made every day of my life a misery, until merciful death freed me from his tyranny." Eleanor had heard hints of the old Duke's character from servants' gossip, but never had anyone spoken of it so directly. "I'm sorry, I had no idea." "Few did. That is the nature of such men. They are skilled at maintaining public facades while committing private atrocities. When I saw that look in your eyes at the ball, I recognized it immediately, and I decided that no other young woman would suffer as I had suffered, not if I possessed the power to prevent it." The Dowager Duchess fixed Eleanor with a penetrating stare. "But I did not save you, only to have you waste away in self-pity and isolation. You have been given a second chance at life, Eleanor. What do you intend to do with it?" It was a question Eleanor had been asking herself since arriving in Bath. She was 20 years old, unmarried, with a somewhat tarnished reputation and no prospects. She could return to Ashbourne Manor and live quietly as the Duke's ward until some suitable, if less advantageous, marriage could be arranged. Or she could— "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no skills beyond those expected of a gentleman's daughter. I can play the pianoforte adequately, paint watercolors, speak French and Italian, and manage a household, none of which provides a path to independence." "Can you think?" the Dowager Duchess asked bluntly. Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon? can you think? The older woman leaned forward, her eyes bright with an almost predatory intensity. Can you read, analyze, form opinions, engage in intellectual discourse? Because if so, my dear, you possess the most valuable skill of all, and one that far too many young women are encouraged to suppress. Yes, Eleanor said slowly. I love to read. Philosophy, history, literature. The Duke's library at Ashbourne Manor is extensive, and he never restricted my access to it. Excellent. Then your education shall continue, but in a different form. Bath, my dear Eleanor, is not merely a resort for aging dowagers and gouty gentlemen. It is also home to a most interesting circle of individuals, intellectuals, reformers, writers, and artists who gather regularly to discuss ideas that would scandalize the stuffier members of society. Tomorrow evening, you shall accompany me to one such gathering. Eleanor felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity, perhaps even excitement. What sort of gathering? A salon hosted by Mrs. Minerva Blackwell, a widow of independent means and considerable intellect. The conversation ranges from literature to politics to social reform. You'll find it quite different from the insipid discussions typical of London drawing rooms. The Dowager Duchess rose, smoothing her skirts. Now, we must select your attire for this afternoon's callers. We're expecting Mrs. Blackwell herself, along with her nephew, Dr. Christopher Reed, who has recently returned from studying advanced medical techniques on the continent. The mention of the nephew was delivered with just enough emphasis to make Eleanor suspicious. You're matchmaking, aren't you? I'm introducing you to interesting people who might become friends and intellectual companions, the Dowager Duchess replied with feigned innocence. If romance should happen to blossom, well, that would be a pleasant bonus. But my primary goal, child, is to remind you that your worth is not defined by marriage or social status, but by the content of your character and the quality of your mind. That afternoon, Eleanor dressed with more care than she had taken in weeks, selecting a day dress of soft rose muslin that brought colour to her pale cheeks. Martha, who had accompanied her to Bath, arranged her hair in a simpler style than London fashion would have demanded, soft curls framing her face rather than the elaborate coiffures that had been necessary for balls and formal dinners. Mrs. Minerva Blackwell arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, and Eleanor took an instant liking to the woman. In her early 50s, Mrs. Blackwell possessed the kind of handsome, lived-in features that suggested both intelligence and humour. Her grey eyes were sharp and assessing, but not unkind, and her conversation revealed a formidable intellect, unfettered by conventional expectations. Miss Eversley, Mrs. Blackwell said warmly after the initial pleasantries had been exchanged, the Dowager Duchess has told me something of your recent ordeal. I hope you'll forgive my impertinence, but I wanted to express my admiration for your courage in speaking the truth about Lord Stirling. Too many women suffer in silence for fear of social condemnation. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Thank you. Though I confess, I'm not certain it was courage so much as desperation. I could not bear the thought of spending my life shackled to such a man. Desperation or courage, in the end, the result is the same. You freed yourself from a terrible fate, and in doing so, you may have saved others from similar suffering. Mrs. Blackwell leaned forward slightly. Have you given any thought to what you might do now? The Dowager Duchess mentioned you possess a keen intellect and a love of learning. Before Eleanor could answer, the door opened again to admit Mrs. Blackwell's nephew. Dr. Christopher Reed was nothing like Eleanor had expected based on the Dowager Duchess's description. Instead of the elderly, stuffy physician she had envisioned, Dr. Reed appeared to be in his early 30s. Tall and lean, with sandy hair that looked as though it had been styled by the wind itself, warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and an open, friendly countenance that immediately put Eleanor at ease. "Forgive my tardiness, Aunt Minerva," he said, his voice carrying a hint of Yorkshire in its vowels. "I was detained by a patient who required more attention than anticipated." He turned to Eleanor with a genuine smile. "Miss Eversley, I presume. I'm Christopher Reed. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Eleanor found herself smiling in return, genuinely this time. "Dr. Reed, your aunt has been telling me about your studies on the continent. Has she? I hope she hasn't bored you with too many medical details. I'm afraid I have a tendency to become overly enthusiastic about my work." He settled into a chair, accepting tea from a servant with a nod of thanks. Treating the servant, Eleanor noticed, with the same courtesy he would show a peer. "But I'd much rather hear about your interests, Miss Eversley. The Dowager Duchess mentioned you're a reader." What followed was the most enjoyable afternoon Eleanor had spent in months. Dr. Reed proved to be not only intelligent, but genuinely interested in her opinions, engaging her in discussions ranging from the Gothic novels they both enjoyed to more serious topics of social reform and medical advancement. He spoke of his work with poor patients in London's East End, of his belief that quality medical care should be available to all regardless of social station, and of his frustration with the rigid hierarchies that governed British society. "I spent 2 years studying in Edinburgh and then Paris," he explained, his eyes alight with passion for his subject. "The physicians there are making remarkable advances in surgery and the treatment of infectious diseases. But more than that, they approach medicine as a science rather than an art, practiced primarily on the wealthy. I've come to believe that a society's true measure is how it treats its most vulnerable members." Eleanor found herself drawn into the conversation with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt since before her engagement to Lord Stirling. Here, finally, was someone who saw her not as a potential wife to be molded to his specifications, but as a thinking person whose opinions mattered. "But surely," she ventured, "the challenges are immense. Establishing hospitals and clinics for the poor would require substantial funding, not to mention overcoming the prejudices of those who believe poverty is a moral failing rather than a circumstance." "Precisely." Dr. Reed leaned forward eagerly, "which is why education and advocacy are so crucial. Change must come not just from those who wish to help, but from a fundamental shift in how society views its responsibilities. That's why gatherings like my aunt's salons are so important. They create spaces where ideas can be shared and refined." The Dowager Duchess and Mrs. Blackwell exchanged meaningful glances, clearly pleased by how well their protégés were interacting. When the afternoon concluded and Mrs. Blackwell and Dr. Reed took their leave, Eleanor found herself genuinely looking forward to the next day's salon. That evening, as Martha helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been preparing to sacrifice her happiness for the sake of security and social advancement. Now, she was in Bath, discussing social reform with a physician who treated servants with the same respect as aristocrats, and contemplating a future that was uncertain but somehow filled with possibility. "You look happier, miss, if you don't mind my saying," Martha observed, as she brushed out Eleanor's hair. "More like yourself than you've been in months." "Do I?" Eleanor smiled at her reflection in the mirror. "Perhaps because I'm beginning to remember who myself actually is, rather than who I was supposed to become." The following evening, Eleanor accompanied the Dowager Duchess to Mrs. Blackwell's salon, held in a handsome drawing room decorated with more books than paintings. The assembled guests were unlike any social gathering Eleanor had attended in London. Here were writers, artists, a lady naturalist who had travelled to the Americas, a retired naval captain who had served in the recent war with France, and even a Quaker gentleman involved in the abolition movement. Dr. Reed was already present when they arrived, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly when his face lit up at her entrance. He immediately crossed the room to greet her, offering his arm to escort her to a seat near the discussion circle. "I'm so pleased you came," he said warmly. "Tonight's discussion is on Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Have you read it?" Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement. "I have, though I was forced to hide my copy from Lord Stirling when we were engaged. He considered such texts dangerously radical." Dr. Reed's expression darkened. "Of course he did. Men like him fear nothing so much as women who think for themselves. But here, Miss Eversley, you need hide nothing. Your thoughts and opinions are valued precisely because they come from an intelligent, thinking mind. The discussion that evening was revelatory. Eleanor found herself engaging in debates about education, social reform, and women's roles in society with a freedom she had never before experienced. Her opinions were not merely tolerated, but actively sought. When she made a particularly insightful point about the connection between education and economic independence, several of the guests nodded in approval, and Dr. Reed regarded her with what could only be described as admiration. As the evening wore on and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Dr. Reed maneuvered to sit beside Eleanor on a settee slightly removed from the main group. "I hope you don't think me too forward, Miss Eversley," he said quietly, "but I wanted to tell you how much I've enjoyed our conversations, both today and this evening. It's rare to meet someone who combines genuine intellect with such humanity and courage." Eleanor felt herself blushing. "You're very kind, Dr. Reed, though I'm not certain I've shown much courage. I feel rather as though I've been fleeing from one circumstance into another." "Fleeing from danger is intelligent, not cowardly," Dr. Reed replied seriously. "And from what the Dowager Duchess has told me, in the strictest confidence, I assure you, you showed remarkable bravery in speaking the truth about Lord Stirling, knowing it would cost you your engagement and possibly your reputation." "The truth is," Eleanor said softly, surprising herself with her candor, "I felt I had no choice. The thought of marrying him, of spending my life under his control, was more terrifying than any social consequences. But now I find myself rather at loose ends. I have no purpose, no direction. I'm simply drifting." Dr. Reed was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but intent. "May I make a suggestion that might sound rather unconventional?" "Please do. I find I'm developing a taste for the unconventional. My clinic in London, the one I mentioned yesterday, is in desperate need of someone who can help manage its operations. We require someone intelligent enough to keep accurate medical records, compassionate enough to interact with patients from all walks of life, and brave enough to work in conditions that many of your social standing would find appalling. The position would offer no social prestige and only a modest salary, but it would provide purpose and independence." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Would such work interest you, Miss Eversley?" Eleanor stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. What he was proposing was radical. A young woman of good family working in a medical clinic for the poor. It would scandalize what remained of her social connections and effectively end any hopes of a conventional marriage. But as she considered the prospect, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a sense of rightness, of possibility, that she had never experienced when contemplating her future as Lady Stirling. "I think," she said slowly, "that it would interest me very much indeed." Dr. Reed's face broke into a brilliant smile. "Then perhaps, with the Dowager Duchess's permission, we might discuss the details further. The position wouldn't begin immediately. You'd need time to prepare, and there are certain proprieties we'd need to observe. But if you're truly interested, I believe we could make arrangements that would satisfy even the most stringent chaperone." As they continued to discuss the possibility, Eleanor felt hope unfurling in her chest like a flower opening to the sun. Her life had been irrevocably changed by the events at Devonshire House, but perhaps that change didn't have to be a catastrophe. Perhaps instead it was an opportunity, a chance to forge a new path entirely, one not defined by marriage or social expectations, but by her own choices and her own merits. And if that path happened to lead her into frequent contact with an intelligent, compassionate physician who looked at her as though she were something precious and rare, well, that was simply an added blessing. 3 months passed in Bath, like a healing balm spread over wounded skin. Eleanor flourished under the Dowager Duchess's guidance and the intellectual stimulation of Mrs. Blackwell's salon. Her pallor disappeared, replaced by a healthy glow. The haunted look vanished from her eyes, supplanted by an alert curiosity and growing confidence. Most tellingly, her laughter, genuine and unforced, rang through the Dowager Duchess's townhouse with increasing frequency. The relationship between Eleanor and Dr. Christopher Reed deepened during those months, though always under the watchful eye of propriety. They took walks through Bath's picturesque parks, attended lectures at the Pump Room, and engaged in lengthy discussions about everything from literature to medical ethics. Christopher, for they had progressed to first names during private conversations, treated Eleanor with a respect and intellectual equality she had never before experienced from any man save perhaps the Duke of Ashborn. It was during one such walk in mid-June that Christopher broached a subject he had been considering for some weeks. "Eleanor," he began, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she found endearing, "I wonder if you might consider returning to London. Not permanently necessarily, but for an extended visit. The clinic I told you about is nearly ready to open, and I would very much like you to see it before making any final decisions about the position I mentioned." Eleanor's heart quickened at the suggestion. London, the very name conjured memories both painful and bittersweet. The site of her public humiliation, but also the city where the Duke of Ashborn maintained his primary residence. She had not seen Alexander since her departure for Bath, though they had exchanged several letters. His notes had been kind but formal, expressing relief at her recovery and satisfaction with her new circumstances. Reading between the lines, Eleanor sensed his guilt over the Stirling affair, though she had assured him repeatedly that he bore no blame for Lord Stirling's deception. "Would that be wise?" she asked carefully. "My reputation in London is hardly pristine. My presence might create difficulties for your clinic before it even opens." Christopher stopped walking, turning to face her with an earnest expression. "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to return to the society that judged you so harshly. The East End, where my clinic is located, operates by entirely different rules. There, your courage in standing up to a powerful man will be seen as admirable, not scandalous. And," he hesitated, then continued, "I'll confess a selfish motive. I've grown accustomed to your company these past months. The thought of opening the clinic without you there to share in the achievement feels hollow." Eleanor felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words. Over the past months, she had come to recognize her growing affection for Christopher Reed. He was nothing like the Duke of Ashborn, where Alexander was polished aristocracy, Christopher was unpretentious practicality. Where Alexander moved in the highest circles of power, Christopher chose to work among the lowest. But in his own way, Christopher was just as admirable, and Eleanor found herself drawn to both his principles and his person. "Then yes," she said, smiling up at him, "I shall return to London, though I suspect the Dowager Duchess will insist on accompanying me as chaperone." "I would expect nothing less," Christopher replied, his relief evident. "And there's another reason for the trip. The Royal College of Physicians is hosting a gala in July to raise funds for medical research. It's one of the few occasions where society's elite and the medical community intersect. I've been invited to present my work on infection prevention, and I wondered if you might consider attending as my guest." Eleanor's immediate instinct was to refuse. A society gala, after everything that had happened. But even as the familiar anxiety rose, she felt something else, a stubborn determination not to allow Lord Stirling or anyone else to define the boundaries of her life. "I'll attend," she said firmly, "though I confess the prospect of facing London society again is rather daunting." "You won't be alone," Christopher assured her, taking her hand gently. "I'll be by your side throughout the evening. And Eleanor, you should know, I've come to care for you deeply these past months. When we return to London, I hope we might explore whether what we've found together might grow into something more permanent." It was as close to a declaration of romantic interest as propriety allowed, without a formal courtship, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. She squeezed his hand gently, her eyes bright with emotion. "I would like that very much, Christopher." They returned to London in early July, the Dowager Duchess indeed accompanying them, along with a full contingent of servants and luggage. Eleanor was installed not at Ashbourne Manor, which would have been inappropriate given her growing attachment to Dr. Reed, but at the Dowager Duchess's London townhouse in Mayfair. The first person to call upon her arrival was inevitably the Duke of Ashborn himself. Alexander Caldwell had not been idle during Eleanor's absence. Guilt over his role in the Sterling affair had driven him to investigate more thoroughly the man he had nearly forced his ward to marry. What he discovered had both horrified and enraged him. Lord Sterling's cruelties had not been limited to Ladies Arabella and Eleanor. There were at least 3 other women who had experienced his violence, though all had been too frightened or socially vulnerable to speak publicly. More disturbing still, Alexander's investigations had revealed his own blindness in other matters. As he pored over his memories of Eleanor's final months at Ashbourne Manor, he began to recognize signs he had missed. Her growing quietness, the way she flinched at mentions of Lord Sterling, the forced quality of her smiles, and he began to wonder about other things he might have failed to see. When Eleanor received him in the Dowager Duchess's drawing room that July afternoon, Alexander was struck by the transformation in his former ward. Gone was the pale, frightened girl who had stood frozen on the staircase at Devonshire House. In her place sat a young woman of poise and quiet confidence, dressed simply but elegantly in a day dress of lavender muslin that brought out the warm tones in her hazel eyes. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising to curtsy. "How kind of you to call." "Eleanor?" Alexander took her extended hand, bowing over it formally. But his eyes, when they met hers, were troubled. "You look well. Bath appears to have agreed with you." "It did indeed," Eleanor replied, gesturing for him to sit. "The Dowager Duchess was an excellent physician for my wounded spirits, as was the change of scene and the intellectual stimulation of new friends." There was a brief, awkward silence. They had once conversed with such ease, but now there seemed to be a wall between them, built, Alexander suspected, from his own failures as her guardian. "Eleanor, I must apologize," he began, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I failed you terribly in the matter of Lord Sterling. I should have been more thorough in my investigations, more attentive to your feelings, more—" "Please don't," Eleanor interrupted gently. "We've been through this in our correspondence, Your Grace. Lord Sterling deceived us both. He was a skilled actor who showed different faces to different people. You are not responsible for his villainy." "But I am responsible for your welfare," Alexander insisted, leaning forward in his chair. "And I nearly delivered you into the hands of a monster. The thought of what might have happened had you not spoken up at the ball—" He broke off, unable to complete the horrifying thought. Eleanor's expression softened. "But I did speak up, thanks in no small part to the education and confidence you fostered in me during my years at Ashbourne Manor. You taught me to think for myself, Your Grace, to trust my own judgment. That education saved me." Alexander studied her carefully, noting the changes in her demeanor. "You seem different, stronger somehow." "I am different," Eleanor acknowledged. "I've spent these past months discovering who I am independent of anyone else's expectations. It's been rather illuminating." Before Alexander could respond, the door opened to admit the Dowager Duchess, and following close behind her, Dr. Christopher Reed. Alexander rose immediately, his aristocratic instincts evaluating the newcomer in an instant. Dr. Reed was clearly a gentleman, though not of the nobility. His clothing was well-made but practical, his bearing confident, but without the polished veneer of someone raised in high society. But it was the way Eleanor's face lit up at the physician's entrance, the unconscious way she leaned slightly toward him, that told Alexander everything he needed to know. His former ward, he corrected himself, was falling in love. The realization struck him with unexpected force. Of course, Eleanor would move on with her life. Of course, she would find someone who appreciated her intelligence and spirit. It was exactly what he should want for her, And yet, as he watched Dr. Reed cross the room to greet Eleanor with obvious affection, Alexander felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. "Your Grace," the Dowager Duchess said with barely concealed amusement, "allow me to present my great-nephew, Dr. Christopher Reed. Christopher, this is the Duke of Ashborn, Eleanor's guardian." "Former guardian," Alexander corrected automatically, extending his hand to Dr. Reed. "A pleasure, Doctor. I've heard of your work in the East End. It's quite commendable." "Thank you, Your Grace," Christopher replied, his handshake firm and direct. "Though I confess my work would be impossible without the support of benefactors like your aunt. The Dowager Duchess has been extraordinarily generous in funding the new clinic." As the conversation continued, Alexander found himself analyzing Dr. Reed with the same thoroughness he should have applied to Lord Stirling. But to his frustration, he could find no fault with the man. Christopher Reed was intelligent, principled, and clearly devoted to Eleanor in a way that was both respectful and genuine. He treated her as an intellectual equal, sought her opinions, and deferred to her judgment on matters where her expertise surpassed his own. In short, Dr. Reed was exactly the sort of man Alexander should have been searching for when considering Eleanor's future. So why did the thought of them together fill him with such profound unease? The gala at the Royal College of Physicians took place 3 weeks later, and Eleanor prepared for it with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had spent hours with the Dowager Duchess and a talented modiste, creating a gown that would make a statement, a dress of deep sapphire blue silk that brought out the richness of her hair and the intelligence in her eyes. It was elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but not showy. It declared that Miss Eleanor Ashford Eversley had nothing to apologize for and would not hide in shame. When Dr. Reed arrived to escort her that evening, his expression of stunned admiration was all the confirmation Eleanor needed that the gown had achieved its purpose. "Eleanor, you look absolutely magnificent," he breathed, offering his arm. "Though I fear I shall spend the entire evening fighting off rivals for your attention." "I doubt that very much," Eleanor replied with a smile, though she was secretly pleased by the compliment. "The medical community is unlikely to take much interest in a former ward with a scandalous past." How wrong she proved to be. Eleanor's entrance on Dr. Reed's arm caused a palpable ripple through the assembled guests. The story of the broken Stirling engagement had made its way through all levels of society, and many present were curious to see the young woman who had so publicly defied one of England's most eligible peers. Some regarded her with disapproval, but more, particularly the younger physicians and their wives, looked at her with respect and even admiration. Dr. Reed's presentation on infection prevention was brilliant, demonstrating both the depth of his knowledge and his passion for improving medical care for all classes. Eleanor sat in the front row, her face shining with pride and interest, and she found herself fielding questions afterward from several physicians who were impressed by her evident understanding of the material. It was during the reception following the presentations that Eleanor encountered Lady Arabella Whitmore. Arabella looked better than she had at the disastrous engagement ball. The wild desperation in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet dignity, though shadows of past pain still lingered in her expression. She approached Eleanor hesitantly, as though uncertain of her welcome. "Miss Eversley," she said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you for your courage that night. Speaking up as you did gave me the strength to break free from Lord Stirling's threats. I've left London society behind and am now working with a charitable organization that helps women escape abusive situations. It's not a grand life, but it's mine, and it's honest." Eleanor took Arabella's hands impulsively. "Lady Arabella, you need not thank me. If anything, I should thank you. Your courage in speaking out saved me from a terrible fate." "Perhaps we saved each other," Arabella suggested with a tentative smile. "In any case, I wanted you to know that you're not alone. There are many of us who admire what you did, who understand that sometimes the most courageous act is to refuse what society tells us we should want. The two women talked for several minutes, and Eleanor felt a kinship forming with this woman who had also suffered at Lord Stirling's hands. When they finally parted, it was with a promise to meet again, and Eleanor felt a sense of vindication that she had not expected. It was then that she saw him. Lord Percival Stirling stood across the ballroom, half hidden behind a column, but unmistakably present. He should not have been there. His reputation was in tatters. His debts had forced him to flee to the continent. But here he was, returned to London and somehow gaining entrance to this exclusive event. And he was staring directly at Eleanor with an expression of such malevolent hatred that her blood ran cold. Eleanor's hand tightened convulsively on Christopher's arm. He followed her gaze immediately, his body tensing when he spotted Stirling. "That's him?" Christopher asked quietly, his voice hard. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, "but he shouldn't be here. The Dowager Duchess said he had fled to Paris to escape his creditors." "Then someone has paid his debts," Christopher said grimly, "or he's desperate enough to return despite them. Either way, we should leave." But before they could move, Stirling was approaching, his path direct and purposeful. Other guests stepped aside, sensing the tension, and a hush fell over the immediate area. "Miss Eversley," Stirling said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "How unexpected to see you here. I had heard you'd fled London in disgrace." "Lord Stirling," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I could say the same of you, though in your case the disgrace was rather more deserved." Stirling's eyes flashed with anger, but he maintained his composure. "You always did have a sharp tongue. I had hoped marriage would temper it, but I suppose we'll never know. Tell me, have you found another fool willing to take damaged goods, or are you reduced to dallying with physicians?" His gaze raked over Christopher with obvious disdain. Christopher stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Eleanor and Stirling. "You will speak respectfully to Miss Eversley, or you will answer to me, sir." "Will I?" Stirling laughed, though there was no humour in the sound. "And what will you do, Doctor? Challenge me? You're not even a gentleman by birth, are you? The son of some Yorkshire farmer who managed to scrape together enough education to play at medicine." "Christopher is twice the gentleman you could ever hope to be," Eleanor said fiercely, her fear evaporating in the face of Stirling's cruelty. "He has dedicated his life to helping others, while you have spent yours abusing anyone unfortunate enough to fall within your power. You are a coward and a bully, Lord Stirling, and no amount of title or fortune can disguise that fundamental truth." The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration was absolute. Stirling's face had gone white with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Eleanor genuinely feared he might strike her right there in front of witnesses. But then another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I believe Miss Eversley has made her position clear, Stirling. I suggest you leave immediately, before I have you thrown out bodily." The Duke of Ashborn stood directly behind Stirling, flanked by two other gentlemen, Eleanor recognized as prominent members of Parliament. Alexander's face was set in lines of aristocratic disdain, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. There was something dangerous in his bearing, a reminder that beneath the polished exterior was a man who had commanded soldiers in battle and was more than capable of violence when circumstances warranted. Stirling turned slowly, measuring the Duke and his allies. The calculation in his eyes was visible, 3 peers of the realm against one disgraced lord, with neither friends nor fortune to support him. The mathematics were clear. "This isn't finished," Stirling said quietly, his gaze moving between Eleanor, Christopher, and the Duke. "All of you will regret the humiliation you've heaped upon me. I promise you that." With that, he turned and strode from the ballroom, leaving a wake of scandalized whispers behind him. Alexander immediately turned to Eleanor, his expression transforming from cold authority to warm concern. "Are you all right?" "I am," Eleanor managed, though she was trembling slightly from the confrontation. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your timing was impeccable." "Dr. Reed," Alexander said, addressing Christopher directly. "I believe Miss Eversley would benefit from some fresh air. Perhaps you might escort her to the terrace." It was less a suggestion than a command, and Christopher bristled slightly at the Duke's presumption. But Eleanor's welfare took precedence over wounded pride, so he simply nodded and offered his arm to Eleanor once more. As they made their way toward the terrace doors, Eleanor heard the Duke already working to control the damage, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby guests. Lord Stirling's presence was entirely unexpected and most unwelcome. His debts and disgrace remain very much intact, and his invasion of this respectable gathering will not be tolerated. Miss Eversley, as you all witnessed, conducted herself with remarkable courage and dignity in the face of his unprovoked hostility. On the terrace, Eleanor finally allowed herself to lean against Christopher, her composure cracking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "I should not have come," she whispered. "My presence here has created a scene. Your presence here has shown everyone that you will not be cowed by bullies or hide in shame for sins you did not commit." Christopher interrupted gently, tilting her chin up so she met his eyes. "Eleanor, you were magnificent in there. Frightening, certainly, but magnificent nonetheless." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "For a moment I thought he might actually strike me. He wouldn't have dared, not with so many witnesses." "But Eleanor, I think you should know, the Duke was watching you all evening. Even before Stirling appeared, His Grace's attention rarely strayed far from where you stood." Christopher's expression was carefully neutral, but Eleanor sensed a question beneath his words. "Alexander, the Duke feels responsible for me," Eleanor explained, though even to her own ears the explanation sounded insufficient. "He blames himself for not seeing Lord Stirling's true nature before proposing the match." Is that all it is?" Christopher asked quietly. "Responsibility." Eleanor met his gaze, seeing in his eyes a vulnerability that touched her heart. He was asking, she realized, whether her affections might still be engaged elsewhere, whether the Duke's presence posed a threat to what was developing between them. "Yes," she said firmly, believing it to be true. "I care for Alexander as one might care for a brother or guardian. But you, Christopher, what I feel for you is entirely different." Relief flooded Christopher's features. He raised Eleanor's gloved hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. "Then perhaps, when circumstances are more settled, when Lord Stirling is dealt with and you've had time to be certain of your feelings, I might call upon you formally, with the intention of courting you properly." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time. "I would like nothing more." They stood together on the terrace as the summer evening deepened into night, both of them aware that Lord Stirling's threats were not empty, that challenges lay ahead. But for this moment they had each other, and that was enough. Inside, the Duke of Ashborn watched them through the terrace doors, a complex mix of emotions warring in his chest. Relief that Eleanor was safe, approval that she had found someone worthy of her affection. And beneath it all, something he refused to examine too closely, something that felt uncomfortably like regret. The summer of 1815 proved to be one of dramatic change across England. Napoleon had been definitively defeated at Waterloo in June, ending decades of war and ushering in a new era of peace and reconstruction. London celebrated with balls, illuminations, and public festivities that lasted for weeks. But for Eleanor Ashford Eversley, the most significant changes were far more personal. Dr. Christopher Reed's clinic in London's East End opened in August to considerable fanfare within the medical community, though it was largely ignored by fashionable society. The building, a converted warehouse on Whitechapel Road, had been transformed through the Dowager Duchess's funding and Christopher's vision into a clean, well-equipped facility where the poor could receive medical care regardless of their ability to pay. Eleanor had thrown herself into the clinic's preparation with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. Working alongside Christopher, she had organized the medical record system, trained volunteers in basic nursing care, and helped establish procedures for patient intake and treatment. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking. The poverty and suffering she witnessed in the East End was unlike anything she had encountered in her sheltered life at Ashbourne Manor. But it was also deeply fulfilling in a way that planning balls and managing household accounts had never been. The arrangement had been carefully structured to preserve propriety. Eleanor worked at the clinic 3 days per week, always accompanied by a chaperone and departing well before dark. The Dowager Duchess had quietly spread word that Miss Eversley was engaged in charitable work under her sponsorship, framing Eleanor's activities in terms society could accept. It helped that several other well-born ladies, inspired by Eleanor's example, had begun volunteering their time to similar causes. Christopher's formal courtship of Eleanor had begun in July, with all appropriate permissions secured and proprieties observed. The Duke of Ashborn, as Eleanor's former guardian, had given his blessing, though Eleanor couldn't help but notice a certain tension in Alexander's demeanor whenever Christopher was mentioned. Still, he had been nothing but correct in his behavior, even offering financial support to the clinic as a sign of his approval. As summer deepened into autumn, Eleanor found herself genuinely happy for perhaps the first time since her parents' death. Her relationship with Christopher grew steadily stronger, built on a foundation of shared values, intellectual compatibility, and genuine affection. He made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and treated her with a respect that made her feel valued as a partner rather than a possession. It was on a crisp October morning, as they walked together through one of London's parks, with the Dowager Duchess trailing at a discreet distance, that Christopher finally broached the subject that had been building between them for months. "Eleanor," he began, his voice betraying unusual nervousness, "I wonder if I might speak with you about a matter of some importance." Eleanor smiled, suspecting what was coming. "Of course, Christopher. You know you may speak to me about anything." Christopher stopped walking, turning to face her fully. His brown eyes were serious behind his spectacles, but warm with unmistakable affection. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You have transformed not just my clinic, but my entire existence. Your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, all of it has shown me what true partnership could be. Eleanor, I know my prospects are not what a woman of your birth might have expected. I cannot offer you a title or vast estates. My work will always take me among society's most disadvantaged, and the life I lead is not an easy one. But if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, I promise to spend every day earning that privilege. I will cherish your mind as much as your heart, support your ambitions as much as my own, and love you with everything I am." He pulled a small box from his coat pocket, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "This was my grandmother's. She was a Yorkshire farm woman who raised 7 children while helping my grandfather build his practice from nothing. She would have loved you, I think. Will you marry me, Eleanor?" Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, happy tears, the kind she was becoming more accustomed to. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Christopher, I will marry you. And you're wrong about one thing. You're offering me exactly what I hoped for. Not a title or estates, but purpose, partnership and love, freely given rather than demanded." Christopher slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that was just slightly too long and too close for strict propriety, but which the Dowager Duchess, watching from her bench with undisguised satisfaction, chose to overlook. The announcement of Eleanor's engagement to Dr. Christopher Reed appeared in the Times the following week, and the reaction from London society was mixed. Some of the more progressive elements praised Eleanor's choice, noting that marriages based on genuine affection and shared values were preferable to the cold alliances of convenience that dominated the town. Others clucked their tongues at the misalliance, a gentleman's daughter marrying a mere physician, and one who worked among the poor at that. It was all very irregular. But Eleanor found she cared remarkably little what society thought. She had learned, through her ordeal with Lord Stirling, that society's approval was a fickle thing, easily lost, and often based on superficial judgments rather than true worth. The people whose opinions mattered to her, the Dowager Duchess, Mrs. Blackwell, the patients and volunteers at the clinic, and Christopher himself, were all delighted by the engagement. The one reaction that troubled Eleanor, however, came from the Duke of Ashborn. Alexander had maintained regular contact with Eleanor throughout the summer and autumn, calling upon her frequently and offering continued financial support for both her personal needs and the clinic's operations. But after the engagement announcement, his visits became less frequent and more formal. When he did call, there was a distance in his manner that had not been there before, a careful courtesy that felt almost like a wall between them. Eleanor tried to dismiss it as natural adjustment. After all, she was no longer his ward, but an independent woman preparing to marry another man. It was appropriate for Alexander to step back, to allow her to build her new life without the complication of his guardianship hanging over everything. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, some easy friendship that had once existed between them. It was the Dowager Duchess who finally addressed the elephant in the room during one of their private conversations in early November. "My nephew is a fool," she announced without preamble, startling Eleanor from her reading. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor set down her book, regarding the older woman with confusion. "Alexander. He's a fool, and I've told him so repeatedly, though he refuses to listen to sense." The Dowager Duchess settled herself in her chair with a huff of exasperation. "The boy has been in love with you for at least a year, possibly longer, but he's too hidebound by notions of propriety and duty to admit it even to himself." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. That's impossible. Alexander thinks of me as a ward, nothing more. He arranged my engagement to Lord Stirling, for heaven's sake." "Yes, and why do you think he did that?" The Dowager Duchess fixed Eleanor with her sharp gaze. "Because he believed it was his duty to see you well settled, yes. But also because he thought his own feelings were inappropriate, given your positions as guardian and ward. He convinced himself that what he felt was merely protective affection, that arranging an advantageous marriage was the proper way to fulfill his responsibilities. It was only after nearly losing you to that monster Stirling that Alexander began to realize the truth of his own heart. But by then, you had fled to Bath and subsequently found Dr. Reed." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her mind racing through memories with this new perspective. Alexander's careful distance whenever Lord Stirling had been mentioned, the way his expression had darkened when Christopher first appeared, the tension she had sensed in him since her engagement. "Could it be true? But even if what you say is correct," Eleanor said slowly, "it changes nothing. I am engaged to Christopher. I care for him deeply. I'm not some prize to be fought over or some silly girl who changes her affections with each new gentleman who expresses interest." "Of course not," the Dowager Duchess agreed. "And I'm not suggesting you should break your engagement. Dr. Reed is an excellent man who will make you very happy, and you love him genuinely. I simply thought you should know the truth before you wed, so that there are no secrets between you and Alexander going forward. He will always be part of your life in some capacity. He's been too important to you to simply disappear. Better to understand his feelings and address them honestly than to pretend they don't exist." Eleanor spent the next several days wrestling with this revelation. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as the Dowager Duchess's imagination. Surely Alexander would have given some indication if he harbored romantic feelings for her. But the more she reflected on their interactions over the past year, the more certain signs began to emerge. The way he had always ensured she had access to intellectual stimulation, his fury upon discovering Lord Stirling's true nature, the barely concealed tension when Christopher entered the picture. And if she was brutally honest with herself, Eleanor had to acknowledge that her own feelings for Alexander were more complex than simple gratitude or fraternal affection. She had loved him once, desperately and hopelessly, during that period before her engagement to Sterling, when she had still been naive enough to dream impossible dreams. But she had buried those feelings so deeply, had convinced herself so thoroughly that they were futile, that she had nearly forgotten they existed. But she loved Christopher now. That was real, honest, and reciprocated. Whatever she had felt for Alexander was in the past. A childish infatuation that she had outgrown, wasn't it? The confrontation, when it came, was not of Eleanor's choosing. She was at the clinic one afternoon in mid-November, reviewing patient records in Christopher's small office, when Alexander arrived unexpectedly. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "In private, if possible." Eleanor glanced around the bustling clinic, recognizing that true privacy was impossible here. "The office will have to suffice, though I'm afraid we'll be interrupted if any emergencies arise." Alexander closed the door behind him, then stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, looking more uncertain than Eleanor had ever seen him. For a long moment, neither spoke. "The Dowager Duchess told you," Alexander finally said. "It wasn't a question." "She suggested that your feelings toward me might be more complicated than I had realized," Eleanor replied carefully. "But Alexander, if you've come to—" "I haven't come to interfere with your engagement," Alexander interrupted. "Dr. Reed is a good man who will make you happy. I have no intention of disrupting that. I needed you to know the truth before you marry. I need to say this once, and then we need never speak of it again." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with suppressed emotion. "I have been blind, Eleanor. Criminally, stupidly blind. I told myself that my feelings for you were those of a guardian for his ward, that the care I took with your happiness was simply duty. I convinced myself that arranging your marriage to Sterling was an act of responsibility rather than cowardice. But the truth I can no longer deny, is that I have been in love with you for longer than I care to admit. And when I saw you terrified on that staircase, when I realized I had nearly delivered you to a monster, it nearly destroyed me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she remained silent, recognizing that Alexander needed to finish. "I know it's too late," he continued. "You've found happiness with Dr. Reed, and I'm genuinely glad for you both. But I couldn't let you marry without telling you the truth. You deserve to know that you are loved, Eleanor, deeply, completely, and without reservation, even if that love can never be acted upon." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. Eleanor rose from behind the desk, moving to stand before Alexander. She reached out and took his hand gently, feeling him tense at the contact. "Alexander," she said softly, "I think I loved you too once. When I was younger and didn't understand the impossibility of such feelings. But that was before Lord Sterling, before Bath, before Christopher. I'm not that girl anymore. I've changed, and my feelings have changed with me. What I feel for Christopher is different from what I once felt for you. It's rooted in who I am now, rather than who I was then. Do you understand?" Alexander nodded slowly, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "I understand, and I'm sorry, Eleanor, for everything. For being blind when you needed me to see, for failing to protect you, for loving you too late." "You didn't fail me," Eleanor said firmly. "You saved me, Alexander. You believed me when I spoke up about Sterling. You ended the engagement despite the social consequences. You gave me the education and confidence to stand up for myself. If you had not done those things, I would not be the woman I am today, the woman Christopher fell in love with. So please don't think of yourself as failing. Think of yourself as succeeding in the most important way possible." Alexander lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a single, gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Be happy, Eleanor. That's all I've ever truly wanted for you." "I will be," she promised. "And Alexander, I hope you'll find your own happiness as well. You deserve it just as much as I do." When Alexander departed, Eleanor stood at the window watching his carriage disappear into London's streets. She felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for what might have been, relief that the truth was finally spoken, and gratitude that they could move forward with honesty rather than unspoken tension. "Everything all right?" Christopher's voice came from the doorway, gentle with concern. Eleanor turned to face the man she was going to marry, seeing in his eyes the trust and love that had been freely offered rather than reluctantly confessed. "Yes," she said, crossing to embrace him. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The wedding was planned for February, a quiet ceremony to be held at the chapel on the Dowager Duchess's estate. As autumn gave way to winter, Eleanor prepared for her new life with a sense of peace she had never expected to feel again. She was leaving behind the world of balls and drawing rooms, trading it for a life of purpose and partnership, in service to those society often forgot. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, she thought of what might have been had circumstances been different, had Alexander recognized his feelings sooner, well, that was only human. But Eleanor had learned that the path not taken often glimmers more brightly than it deserves, while the path chosen, though harder and less romantic, leads to genuine happiness. She had chosen her path, and she would walk it without regret. The spring of 1816 arrived with unusual warmth, painting London in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise new beginnings. Eleanor Eversley Reed, she still felt a small thrill each time she thought of her married name, stood at the window of the modest townhouse she now shared with her husband in a respectable but unfashionable quarter of London, watching the early morning light paint the rooftops in soft pastels. 6 months had passed since her quiet wedding in the Dowager Duchess's chapel, a simple ceremony attended by only close friends and family. Christopher's colleagues from the medical community had mixed freely with the few members of Eleanor's former social circle who had remained loyal, creating an atmosphere of genuine warmth rather than rigid formality. Even the Duke of Ashborn had attended, standing as a witness and managing to smile with what appeared to be genuine happiness for the couple. The months since had been a revelation to Eleanor. Marriage to Christopher was nothing like what she had been taught to expect from a husband. He consulted her on matters great and small, from the running of their household to difficult medical decisions at the clinic. Her opinions were not merely tolerated, but actively sought. When they disagreed, which they did occasionally and sometimes heatedly, Christopher engaged with her arguments rather than simply dismissing them as female irrationality. More than that, he encouraged her intellectual pursuits. The small study in their townhouse housed an ever-growing collection of books on medicine, philosophy, and social reform. Eleanor had begun attending lectures at the Royal Society, seated in the Ladies' Gallery, but present nonetheless. She had even begun writing articles under a male pseudonym about the conditions she witnessed in the East End, submitting them to progressive journals where they were occasionally accepted and published. The clinic had become the center of their shared life. Eleanor worked there 4 days a week now, having expanded her role beyond simple administration to include patient education and advocacy. She had developed a particular interest in maternal and infant health, recognizing that many deaths could be prevented through better hygiene and basic medical knowledge. Working with Christopher and a midwife named Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, Eleanor had established classes for expectant mothers, teaching them techniques for safer childbirth and infant care. The work was often heartbreaking. Despite their best efforts, they lost patients. Children who might have survived with earlier intervention, mothers whose bodies were worn out from poverty and too many pregnancies, men whose injuries from dangerous factory work were beyond saving. But they also celebrated triumphs: babies delivered safely who might otherwise have been lost, infections caught early and treated successfully, chronic conditions managed so that patients could return to productive lives. On this particular morning, Eleanor was preparing to visit one of her favorite success stories, young Margaret Turner, a 16-year-old girl who had arrived at the clinic 6 months ago pregnant, alone and terrified after being dismissed from her position as a housemaid, had given birth to a healthy daughter 3 weeks prior. Eleanor had helped Margaret through the pregnancy, connected her with a respectable boarding house for women in difficult circumstances, and was now assisting her in finding work that would allow her to support herself and her child. "You're up early," Christopher observed, entering the bedroom with 2 cups of tea. Still in his dressing gown, his sandy hair tousled from sleep, he looked nothing like the polished gentleman Eleanor had been taught to admire during her debut season. And yet she found him infinitely more attractive. There was an authenticity to Christopher that no amount of carefully styled cravats and perfectly tailored coats could match. "I want to visit Margaret before clinic hours begin," Eleanor explained, accepting her tea gratefully. "She's struggling with how to care for little Emma while also preparing to return to work. I thought I might stay with the baby for a few hours to give Margaret rest." Christopher settled beside her on the window seat, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been considering something. The clinic serves many young women in situations similar to Margaret's. What if we were to establish a proper shelter? A place where they could stay during and after their pregnancies, with medical care, job training, and childcare support. It would require significant funding, of course, but with the Dowager Duchess's backing and perhaps support from some of the charitable organizations, Eleanor felt excitement kindle in her chest. "Christopher, that's brilliant. We could model it on the Magdalen Hospital, but without the religious restrictions and moral judgment. A place that treats these young women with dignity rather than shame." This was what marriage to Christopher meant. Conversations over morning tea that might actually change lives, partnerships that extended far beyond the domestic sphere into meaningful work in the world. Eleanor had never been happier. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A few moments later, their housekeeper appeared, bearing a note on a silver tray. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Reed, but this just arrived for you. The messenger said it was urgent." Eleanor took the note with some trepidation. Urgent messages were rarely good news. Breaking the seal, she scanned the contents quickly, then looked up at Christopher with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. "It's from Lord Sterling's solicitors," she said slowly. "Lord Sterling was killed 3 days ago in Paris. Apparently he insulted a French officer in a gambling hell and was challenged to a duel. He's dead, Christopher. He can't threaten anyone ever again." Christopher took the letter, reading it carefully. "I won't pretend to mourn him. The man was a monster who caused untold suffering. But Eleanor, how do you feel about this news?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, examining her own reactions. She felt relief, certainly. The vague threat that had hung over them since the confrontation at the Royal College Gala was finally, definitively ended. But she also felt something like pity for the man Sterling might have been had he chosen differently. Developed empathy rather than cruelty, partnership rather than domination. "I feel free," she finally answered, "and I feel grateful that I escaped a fate that would have destroyed me. But most of all, I feel determined to ensure that other women don't face similar situations. Sterling was not unique, Christopher. There are countless men who abuse the power society grants them over women. If we can help even a few escape such marriages, establish even one shelter where women are treated with dignity and given real choices, that would be a worthwhile memorial to what Arabella and I endured." Christopher pulled her into an embrace, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then that's precisely what we'll do. I'll write to the Dowager Duchess this morning about the shelter proposal." Later that afternoon, after Eleanor had visited Margaret and spent several rewarding hours helping to care for baby Emma, she found herself with an unexpected visitor at the clinic. The Duke of Ashborn had called, requesting a private word with both Eleanor and Christopher. They received him in Christopher's small office, and Eleanor was struck by how different Alexander looked from the last time she had seen him. There was a lightness to his expression that had been absent for months, and his eyes held none of the suppressed pain that had haunted them at her wedding. "Forgive the unannounced visit," Alexander began, accepting the chair Christopher offered. "But I wanted to share some news with you both, and I thought it best done in person." Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, feeling a flutter of curiosity. "What news?" Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his aristocratic features. "I'm engaged to be married to Lady Victoria Hartley, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton. We met at a house party last month, and I found myself quite captivated by her intelligence and spirit. She's involved in various reform movements, prison reform specifically, and shares many of the progressive views you both advocate. I believe you'd like her enormously, Eleanor." Eleanor felt a rush of genuine happiness for her former guardian. "Alexander, that's wonderful. I'm so pleased for you." "As am I," Christopher added warmly. "Lady Victoria sounds like an excellent match." "She is," Alexander agreed. "And I have you both to thank in a way. Watching you build a life together based on shared values rather than social expectations, it showed me what marriage could be when entered into with genuine affection and respect. I stopped looking for what society expected me to want and started looking for what I actually needed. And I found Victoria." The conversation continued for another half hour, with Alexander sharing details of his courtship and wedding plans. When he finally took his leave, Eleanor accompanied him to the clinic's entrance. "Alexander," she said quietly, stopping him before he could depart, "thank you for telling me in person. And thank you for everything. For being honest last autumn. For attending our wedding. For finding your own happiness. It means more than I can say." Alexander took her hand, but this time the gesture held none of the tortured longing of their previous private conversation. Instead, it was warm with genuine friendship. "You saved me too, you know, by refusing to settle for a loveless marriage, by standing up to Sterling, by choosing your own path. You gave me permission to do the same. We're both exactly where we're supposed to be, Eleanor. Different paths, but equally worthwhile." After he left, Eleanor returned to find Christopher waiting in the office, his expression slightly anxious. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfect," Eleanor replied honestly, crossing to embrace her husband. "Truly, Christopher, I am happier than I ever imagined possible." As spring deepened into summer, Eleanor's vision for a shelter for women began to take concrete form. The Dowager Duchess had indeed provided funding, along with several other wealthy benefactors who were impressed by the clinic's work. By August, they had secured a building, a former boarding house that could be converted to provide both temporary housing and job training facilities. Lady Arabella Whitmore, who had continued her own work helping abused women, joined the project as its primary administrator. Working alongside Eleanor, she helped design programs that would provide not just shelter, but genuine pathways to independence, training in respectable trades, literacy classes, legal assistance in navigating marriage laws, and property rights. The Victoria House, named not for the future Queen but for the Duke's fiancé, who had contributed substantially to the project, opened its doors in October to immediate demand. Within a month, it was operating at capacity, housing 20 women and their children in various stages of escaping abusive situations or recovering from abandonment. Eleanor found herself stretched thin between the clinic, Victoria House, her writing, and her marriage, but she had never felt more fulfilled. This was the life she had been meant for, not drawing rooms and balls and insipid conversation, but meaningful work that made tangible differences in people's lives. The Christmas season of 1816 found Eleanor and Christopher hosting a small gathering in their townhouse, a tradition they had established of bringing together the various threads of their lives. The Dowager Duchess attended, naturally, along with Mrs. Blackwell, Lady Arabella, several of Christopher's medical colleagues, and the Duke and Duchess of Ashborn. For Alexander had married in November, and Eleanor had indeed found Victoria to be everything he had promised, intelligent, compassionate, and refreshingly frank. As Eleanor surveyed her guests, this eclectic mix of aristocrats and physicians, reformers and intellectuals, she reflected on how far she had travelled from that terrified girl frozen on the staircase at Devonshire House. That girl had been prepared to sacrifice her happiness, her very self, for the sake of security and social acceptance. But that girl no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had chosen her own path, who had discovered that true security came not from marriage to a powerful man, but from developing her own capabilities and character. A woman who had learned that the most confining cages were often gilded, and that freedom, though frightening, was infinitely more precious than any comfort purchased through surrender. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Eleanor and Christopher were preparing for bed, he pulled her into his arms with a seriousness that caught her attention. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice carrying both excitement and trepidation. "I've been offered a position, a chair in medicine at the new university in Durham. It would mean leaving London, moving north, starting over in many ways. The salary would be substantially better than what we're managing now, and it would come with a house, status, security. But it would also mean leaving the clinic, leaving Victoria House, leaving everything we've built here. I wanted to discuss it with you before giving any answer." Eleanor considered the proposal carefully. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she might have urged acceptance, seeing in the university position the kind of respectable stability that society valued. But she had learned something in her months of work in the East End, something fundamental about what actually mattered. "What do you want, Christopher?" she asked. "Not what's sensible or secure or respectable. What do you truly want?" Christopher smiled, and Eleanor saw her answer in his expression before he spoke. "I want to stay here. I want to continue our work. The clinic, the shelter, the reforms we're pushing for. This is what I'm meant to do, Eleanor. The university position would be prestigious and comfortable, but it would take me away from the work that matters most, unless you feel differently. If you want the security and status such a position would provide—" "I want what you want," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "I want to keep doing the work that changes lives. I want to continue building something meaningful rather than accepting something comfortable. Christopher, we are exactly where we're meant to be." Relief flooded Christopher's features. "Thank God. I was hoping you'd say that." He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eleanor Reed. Your courage, your compassion, your stubborn insistence on making the world better despite all obstacles. I am the luckiest man alive." And I love you," Eleanor replied, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones, "for seeing me not as I was expected to be, but as I actually am, for giving me the freedom to become the person I was meant to be." As she drifted to sleep that night, wrapped in her husband's arms in their modest townhouse far from the grand estates of her youth, Eleanor reflected on the strange paths life sometimes took. She had been raised to value title, fortune, and social position above all else. She had been taught that a woman's worth was measured by the advantageous marriage she could secure, that happiness was less important than security. But life had taught her different lessons. It had shown her that the gilded cage was still a cage, no matter how beautiful its bars. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That true partnership came not from one person's dominance over another, but from mutual respect and shared purpose. Most importantly, Eleanor had learned that it was possible to bloom wherever you were planted, but only if you had the courage to break through the soil, to push toward the light, to become yourself rather than what others demanded you should be. She had been planted in tragedy and nearly crushed by cruelty, but she had chosen to grow anyway, to reach for the light of her own agency and purpose. And in doing so, she had discovered that the truest freedom came not from escaping all constraints, but from choosing which constraints to accept and which to shatter. Eleanor Eversley had been freed from one cage, only to discover she had been living in another, larger one all along, the cage of societal expectations and predetermined roles. But Eleanor Reed had learned to fly, and she would spend the rest of her life teaching other women to do the same. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you thought of Eleanor and Christopher's journey. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for listening, and until next time.